Here's the part one keep coming back to. Police had not accused Sarah Boone of murder. They had not cornered her in an interrogation room. They had not shown her some hidden piece of evidence. They had not told her they believed her story was false. They were still standing outside her apartment, trying to understand how a 42-year-old man had ended up dead beside a suitcase. And Sarah did something almost casually. She handed them her phone. Go ahead. Look through it. If you are an investigator, that kind of cooperation can mean a lot of things. Maybe the person has nothing to hide. Maybe they genuinely want answers. Maybe they are so confident in their version of events that they cannot imagine anything on that device hurting them. Keep that thought in the back of your mind. Because before this was over, the most damaging evidence against Sarah Boone would not come from a hidden camera, a secret witness, or some brilliant forensic trick. It would come from Sarah Boone herself. Just after 1 p.m. on February 24, 2020, emergency dispatchers in Orange County, Florida, received a call from a woman living in Winter Park. Her boyfriend was dead. His name was Jorge Torres Jr. He was 42. Sarah said something had gone terribly wrong the night before. She and Jorge had been drinking wine, doing artwork, putting together a puzzle, and playing around inside the apartment. At some point, according to her, they decided to play hide-and-seek. Already, that is an unusual sentence when you are talking about two adults in their 40s. But unusual does not mean criminal. People drink. People joke around. People do stupid things. Sarah said Jorge climbed into a large suitcase. She zipped him inside. She described it as part of the game. And somewhere during all of this, she said, she went upstairs, got into bed, and passed out. When she woke up, hours had gone by. That was when she remembered. Jorge. The suitcase. She rushed downstairs, opened it, pulled him out, and realized something was very wrong. On the 911 call, she described him as purple and not breathing. She said she had already tried CPR. The dispatcher still gave her instructions and told her to continue chest compressions until help arrived. Now stop there for a second. Because if Sarah's version is true, this is an incredibly bizarre accident. A terrible one, yes. But still an accident. Two people drink too much. A strange joke turns into a game. One person gets zipped into a suitcase. The other person falls asleep and forgets. It sounds almost too ridiculous to be real. But ridiculous things do happen. That is why the first job for investigators was not to decide Sarah was lying. It was to test the story. Could Jorge physically fit inside that suitcase? Yes. Could a person trapped inside suffer from lack of oxygen and positional asphyxia? Yes. Could alcohol explain terrible judgment? Possibly. Could someone really forget that another person was still inside? That question was harder. And Sarah kept insisting on one idea. It was not intentional. That word would become incredibly important. Not intentional. She did not mean to hurt him. She did not mean to leave him there. She did not mean for any of this to happen. If you only had the 911 call, you might reserve judgment. But the apartment was about to start talking. And some of the things inside it did not fit Sarah's explanation nearly as well as she seemed to think. Let's look at the game itself. Not emotionally. Just mechanically. Hide and seek is simple. One person hides. The other person searches. The person hiding normally chooses the hiding place. Sarah's version was stranger than that. According to the account she initially gave investigators, she and Jorge had spent the evening drinking wine, working on art, doing a puzzle, and fooling around. She also described hiding upstairs earlier in the game. Eventually Jorge ended up inside a suitcase in the living room. Sarah zipped it shut. That detail matters. Because Jorge was not simply hiding behind a door or underneath a bed. He was placing himself in a container that he might not be able to open from the inside. And Sarah was the person on the outside controlling the zipper. You can already feel the problem. If the person searching knows exactly where the person hiding is, what game are they actually playing? Maybe it was just drunken nonsense. That is possible. But once the zipper closes, the joke changes. Now one person has control over whether the other person gets out. Sarah would later say the two of them thought it was funny that Jorge could fit inside at all. Jorge was relatively small. She estimated him at around 5'3" and roughly 100 pounds. So, yes, physically, he could fold himself into it. But fitting inside and safely getting back out are two different questions. Sarah said everything was playful. They were laughing. She moved the suitcase. She believed Jorge was fine. And according to the early version of the story, eventually she went upstairs. This is where the logic starts wobbling. Imagine the apartment. Your partner lives with you. You normally sleep in the same bedroom. You have personally zipped that person into a suitcase. You walk upstairs. You get into bed. The other side of the bed is empty. And somehow the suitcase does not come back into your mind strongly enough for you to go downstairs and unzip it. Sarah blamed alcohol. That explanation would become a kind of safety net in her statements. If something did not make sense, she had been drinking. If she could not remember, she had been drinking. If investigators asked why she made a particular decision, she had been drinking. And alcohol absolutely can affect memory. It can impair judgment. It can produce blackouts. The problem is that investigators do not get to stop at the word drunk. They still have to ask whether the physical evidence matches the rest of the account. Emergency crews arrived. Jorge could not be saved. His body was near the suitcase and close to the front area of the apartment. Sarah remained outside while deputies and crime scene personnel worked. Body camera footage captured her speaking with responding officers. And her behavior drew attention. Not because there is one correct way to act when someone dies. There isn't. People react to death in unpredictable ways. Some scream. Some become numb. Some talk constantly. Some focus on irrelevant things because their minds cannot process what is happening. So behavior alone proves very little. That needs to be said clearly. Still, investigators notice Sarah repeatedly focusing on practical comforts. She wanted a drink from inside. She wanted to smoke. She wanted access to the apartment while officers were processing it. That might mean nothing. Or it might matter when placed beside everything else. The much bigger issue was what Jorge's body showed. There were injuries. Not one dramatic wound that immediately explained his death. Something more complicated. The medical examination documented scratches on his back and neck, bruising, injuries around his head and face, and other blunt impact trauma. His ultimate cause of death was consistent with positional asphyxia inside the confined suitcase. But the bruises created a new question. Where did those come from? Sarah had told investigators there had been no physical fight between them that night. So if that was true, what caused the injuries? Maybe Jorge hurt himself struggling. Maybe the suitcase moved. Maybe something happened before he got inside. At this stage, investigators did not yet have a complete answer. But now the file contained two separate problems. Problem 1, Sarah's explanation for forgetting Jorge was difficult to understand. Problem 2, Jorge's body carried injuries that Sarah's story did not clearly explain. And while deputies were still working through those questions, another man was standing outside the apartment. Sarah's ex-husband, Brian Boone. And his presence looked strange enough that investigators wanted to know why he was there. This is one of those details that can send a case in the wrong direction if you react too quickly. Your current boyfriend is dead. Your former husband is standing outside. Of course investigators are going to ask questions. Brian Boone and Sarah were divorced, but they still shared a child. That connection meant they remained in contact. Brian told investigators and later testified that Sarah called him before police arrived and told him Jorge was dead. His response was simple. Call 911. That sounds obvious. But Sarah had not called emergency services first. She called Brian. Why? Fear? Shock? Confusion? Maybe. Brian lives nearby, so he came over. When he entered the apartment, he encountered a scene he clearly did not want to become part of. Jorge was dead. Brian again told Sarah she needed to contact police. He eventually remained nearby while officers arrived, and investigators spoke with him. The more they checked his account, the less he looked like a mysterious third person in the death. Instead, he became valuable for a different reason. He knew Sarah. He knew how alcohol affected her. He knew what her life had looked like before Jorge. And he could help investigators understand why the relationship around this apartment seemed so chaotic. Brian and Sarah had once been married. They had a son. By the time of Jorge's death, the marriage was over, but the custody schedule meant Sarah was supposed to be involved in their son's routine. Brian had been trying to reach her that day. That matters because it helps explain why he was in contact with Sarah before the 911 call. The suspicious-looking ex-husband had a fairly ordinary reason to be communicating with her. So one possible branch of suspicion begins to close. But another one opens. Because Brian's description of Sarah's history included repeated problems involving alcohol and conflict. And there is something else. Something so strange that if this were fiction, you might accuse the writer of being too obvious. For years before Jorge died in a suitcase, law enforcement had already investigated Sarah Boone over a photograph involving a child inside a suitcase. Yes. A suitcase. The child was Sarah's son. She had posted an image on Facebook showing him zipped inside. Authorities looked into it. The Orange County Sheriff's Office later said investigators and the Department of Children and Families determined the situation had been consensual and that the child had not been harmed. No abuse charge came from it. That distinction matters. You cannot take an investigation that ended without a finding of abuse and rewrite it into proof that Sarah had done something criminal years earlier. But you also cannot pretend the coincidence is not strange. Think about what investigators were dealing with in 2020. A woman says her boyfriend voluntarily climbed into a suitcase as part of a playful game. And years earlier, authorities had already encountered an incident in which a child connected to the same woman was photographed inside a zipped suitcase and it too had been described as consensual fun. Does that prove intent? No. Does it prove planning? No. Does it prove Sarah had been thinking about killing someone with luggage for years? Absolutely not. But it does remove one part of the story that might otherwise sound impossible. For Sarah Boone, putting another person inside a suitcase as a joke was apparently not an idea that had appeared for the first time that night. And the case kept producing details like this. Small details. None of them enough by themselves. But each one making the original explanation just a little harder to accept without questions. To understand why Sarah's later defense became so complicated, though, we need to talk about Jorge. Because if you turn this into a simple story of one evil person and one perfect victim, you miss a major part of the actual record. Sarah and Jorge's relationship had a documented history of violence. Police knew their address. They had been called there before. More than once. There were accusations going both directions. In July 2018, both of them were arrested following a domestic incident. Sarah faced an allegation involving strangulation. The charge was later dismissed. Jorge faced a battery allegation. Jorge would be arrested multiple times in connection with alleged violence against Sarah during the relationship. Sarah would later point to this history again and again. And she was not inventing the existence of every incident. There really were police reports. There really were arrests. There really were photographs and videos showing a volatile relationship. The jury would eventually see some of that evidence. One neighbor described hearing them argue frequently. Other evidence showed Jorge behaving violently on previous occasions, including footage involving him striking a television with a baseball bat. The defense would later bring witnesses and experts to explain why someone who experiences repeated domestic violence may respond to danger in ways that outsiders do not immediately understand. So now the case becomes uncomfortable in a different way. Because two things can exist at the same time. Jorge could have behaved violently towards Sarah in the past. And Sarah could still be legally responsible for what happened to Jorge inside that suitcase. Those ideas are not mutually exclusive. That would eventually become the central battle at trial. But police were nowhere near trial yet. They were still trying to understand one night. And the apartment had another witness. Not a person. The walls. Neighbors remembered arguing. That alone was not unusual. Sarah and Jorge had argued before. People living nearby were familiar with noise coming from the apartment. But one neighbor remembered something more specific from the night Jorge died. A heavy crashing sound. Something that sounded as if an object might be moving or falling along the stairs. That detail matters because Jorge had blunt force injuries. Now be careful here. The sound does not prove Sarah threw Jorge down the stairs. It does not prove the suitcase went down the stairs. Nobody standing in the neighboring apartment could see what was happening. What they had was sound. What the medical examiner had was injury. Those two things can be compared. They cannot automatically be fused into certainty. At trial, the medical examiner was asked whether some of Jorge's injuries could be consistent with being struck by a baseball bat or experiencing a fall downstairs. Those possibilities were considered medically plausible. But exactly how every bruise happened was not completely reconstructed. And that uncertainty is important. Because years later, Sarah herself would admit something she had denied in her first police account. She had used a baseball bat while Jorge was inside the suitcase. We will get there. For now, imagine being an investigator standing in that apartment in February 2020. Sarah says there was no fight. Jorge's body shows injuries. Neighbors report arguing and a loud impact. There is a suitcase in the living room. And Sarah's explanation still depends heavily on the idea that this was a playful game followed by a terrible accident. You would probably want to know exactly what happened during the minutes before she went upstairs. Which brings us back to the phone. Sarah gave investigators permission to search it. Verbal consent. Written consent. The device was downloaded. Maybe Sarah thought the phone would support her. Maybe she had completely forgotten what was on it. She would later say she did not remember making the recordings investigators found. Either way, the forensic download produced two videos. 2. The first lasted a little more than 2 minutes. The second was only around 20 seconds. Short clips. That is all. A person could spend 4 years arguing about memories, relationships, alcohol, trauma, intention, and legal definitions. But those few minutes of video changed the entire investigation. Here is why. Until police opened the files, Sarah could still make one crucial claim. Maybe she did not understand Jorge was in danger. Maybe she thought he was joking. Maybe she genuinely forgot. Maybe she zipped the suitcase, walked away, and never realized the situation had become life-threatening. The first video made that much harder. Because Jorge was not silent inside the suitcase. He was talking to her. And Sarah was answering. The first major video was timestamped around 11:12 p.m. Picture the living room. The suitcase is lying on the floor. Jorge is inside. You can see movement from within as he pushes against it. And you can hear his voice. He calls Sarah's name. Again. And again. He tells her he cannot breathe. Not once. Repeatedly. Sarah does not sound confused about who is speaking. She does not seem to believe the suitcase is empty. She responds directly to him. And what she says is the point where the entire tone of the night changes. She tells him, in substance, that this is connected to what he has done to her. She references being choked. She references cheating. She insults him. She laughs. Jorge continues saying he cannot breathe. Sarah continues responding. One of the exchanges is brutally simple. Jorge says he cannot breathe. Sarah tells him that is on him. The arrest affidavit describes the suitcase moving as Jorge pushed against it from inside, apparently trying to get out. This is the moment where you have to go back to Sarah's first explanation. I forgot. That sentence now has a problem. Because the video shows she did not simply zip him inside and immediately lose track of him. She remained engaged with him. She heard him. She spoke to him. And what they were discussing was not hide and seek anymore. It was their relationship. Resentment. Choking. Cheating. Things he had done to her. That does not automatically answer the legal question of intent. It does answer something else. Sarah knew Jorge wanted out. There is no reasonable way to listen to the recording and conclude he was comfortably continuing a playful hiding game. He was asking her to let him out. He was telling her he was having trouble breathing. Now here's where the file gets even stranger. There was another video. Roughly 11 minutes later. The suitcase was no longer in exactly the same position. Jorge's voice was weaker. He was still inside. That gap matters. Because 11 minutes is long enough to do something. Open the zipper. Check on him. Call someone. Walk away and come back. Anything. Instead, according to the evidence, the suitcase remained closed. And if you are watching this as an investigator, you now have to ask the question that Sarah's original story tried to avoid. Was the suitcase being used as part of a game? Or had the suitcase become a way of controlling Jorge? There is a difference. A huge one. Sarah's words on the recording make that difference difficult to ignore. She was not narrating hide and seek. She was confronting him about their relationship while he was physically unable to leave. That does not tell us with certainty what was in her head. We cannot rewind another person's thoughts. Maybe she wanted to frighten him. Maybe she wanted to punish him. Maybe she believed he was exaggerating. Maybe she was too intoxicated to appreciate how quickly the situation could become fatal. Those are possibilities. But once Jorge says he cannot breathe, the risk is no longer invisible. And Sarah is not across town. She is not asleep. She is not unaware. She is standing on the other side of the suitcase. Recording. This is why the phone mattered more than almost anything else. It did not merely add another fact. It rewrote the meaning of facts police already had. The bruises now looked different. The claim of a harmless game looked different. The statement that she had simply forgotten looked different. Even Sarah's decision to hand over the phone looked different. What had seemed like extraordinary cooperation now felt almost surreal. Did she really not remember? Was she so intoxicated that those recordings were gone from her memory? Or was she so convinced of her own explanation that she did not think the clips would be interpreted the way investigators interpreted them? We cannot know exactly. But we do know what happened when detectives brought Sarah back for a formal interview. She arrived still insisting this was an accident. And investigators had the phone. Sarah went to the Orange County Sheriff's Office for another interview. This was where the story stopped being just strange and became a confrontation between memory and evidence. Investigators asked her to go through the night again. Sarah returned to the same basic explanation. They had been drinking. They had been having fun. Jorge got into the suitcase. She zipped him inside. She went upstairs. She fell asleep. She did not intentionally leave him there to die. The detectives pushed on the obvious gaps. Why did she not let him out before going upstairs? Why did she not check on him? What did she think would happen to a person inside a zipped suitcase? Sarah kept coming back to lack of intent. She did not mean it. She did not intend for him to die. This was an accident. And she leaned heavily on alcohol. The detectives also asked about the injuries on Jorge's body. Sarah denied a physical altercation. That answer mattered because the medical examiner had already documented scratches and blunt impact injuries. So now investigators had a statement saying there had been no fight, while Jorge's body suggested that something more physical had occurred. And then they showed her the video. This part is almost impossible to overstate. Imagine sitting in a police interview believing you are explaining a tragic mistake. Then the detectives turn a screen toward you. Your own video starts playing. The suitcase is there. Jorge's voice is there. Your voice is there. Sarah did not want to watch the entire clip. She told investigators she did not remember recording it. And she acknowledged the obvious. It looked bad. That phrase is revealing because, legally, looks bad is not the same as proves murder. But Sarah understood immediately that the recording did not match the emotional tone of the story she had been telling. There was nothing playful about a man repeatedly saying he could not breathe. Detectives asked her why she was telling Jorge that this was for everything he had done to her. Sarah tried to explain the relationship. Jorge had hurt her. He had choked her. He had cheated on her. Their relationship was complicated. That background was real enough to investigate. But the detective kept pulling her back to one basic physical fact. Whatever had happened before, Jorge was inside the suitcase. Sarah was outside. He was asking to get out. She controlled the zipper. Was this revenge? Sarah rejected that. Did she intentionally leave him inside? No. Why did she go upstairs? She did not know. Did she really believe he could get himself out? Her explanation shifted. And this is where you have to be fair. Human memory is messy, especially when alcohol is involved. People under interrogation can explain themselves poorly. Inconsistency alone does not prove murder. But there is a difference between forgetting small details and changing the central reason why you left someone in a sealed suitcase. Was it because she forgot? Was it because she believed Jorge could escape on his own? Was it because she thought he was joking? Was it because she was angry? Those explanations do not sit comfortably together. The detectives kept pressing. Sarah insisted she never intended to kill him. And here is an important distinction in the law. The state did not eventually need to prove that Sarah had spent the day planning Jorge's death. She was charged with second-degree murder. Under Florida law, the prosecution's theory centered on an unlawful killing caused by an act imminently dangerous to another and demonstrating a depraved mind without regard for human life. In simpler terms, the argument was not necessarily, Sarah planned a murder in advance. It was, once Jorge was trapped, begging for help and saying he could not breathe, Sarah's decision to keep him confined showed a level of disregard for human life serious enough to constitute second-degree murder. That is a very different question from premeditation. And it fits the evidence in a very specific way. The video does not need to prove Sarah woke up that morning thinking, I am going to kill Jorge. The video only needs to help a jury understand what Sarah knew while Jorge was inside. He told her. He could not breathe. She heard him. She answered. Police arrested Sarah Boone for second-degree murder. But if you think the case was now simple, it wasn't. Because once defense attorneys began digging through the history of Sarah and Jorge's relationship, they found material that complicated the moral picture. Not necessarily the video. But the question of why Sarah behaved the way she did. And that argument would take more than 4 years to reach a jury. By the time Sarah's case approached trial, the relationship between Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres Jr. had become almost a second case inside the first one. Police records showed repeated domestic disturbances. This was not a couple with one isolated argument. There had been physical confrontations, arrests, accusations, reconciliations, more conflict. Jorge had been arrested multiple times over allegations of violence against Sarah. Sarah herself had also been arrested during a prior incident involving Jorge, though the charge against her from that 2018 case was later dismissed. Neighbors had heard arguments. Body camera footage existed from earlier police responses. Sarah had images and video that she said documented what she endured. The defense would later present evidence of Jorge behaving violently. And that matters. Because once the suitcase video became public, it was easy to flatten the entire relationship into one terrible night. But that is not what the courtroom saw. The jury had to consider a longer history. Sarah said she lived with fear. She said Jorge had choked her, hit her, threatened her. Experts were called to discuss battered spouse syndrome. One psychologist who evaluated Sarah testified that she showed anxiety and PTSD and that, in the expert's opinion, Sarah was experiencing battered spouse syndrome around the time Jorge died. The same expert described narcissistic personality traits but did not diagnose Sarah with narcissistic personality disorder. This is where the case becomes much more difficult than the internet version of it. Because if you believe Sarah experienced domestic violence, what do you do with that fact? You cannot ignore it. But you also cannot use it as an automatic legal permission slip. A history of abuse does not mean every later act against the abusive partner becomes self-defense. Self-defense usually turns on danger. Immediate danger. What threat did the person reasonably believe existed in that moment? And here, the physical situation was unusual. Jorge was inside a suitcase. Sarah was outside. That did not mean Sarah could not be afraid. Fear does not switch off just because the other person is temporarily contained. A person who has been repeatedly abused may still believe the danger will return the second the restraint is removed. That became the defense argument. But the prosecution had a response. If Sarah truly believed she was in immediate danger, she had options that did not require leaving Jorge sealed inside. She could leave the apartment. Call police. Call Brian. Get help. Create distance. Instead, the state argued, she remained near Jorge, recorded him, mocked him, struck the suitcase, and eventually went upstairs. And yes, I said struck the suitcase. Because by trial, Sarah's account contained a major fact that was not part of her original police explanation. A baseball bat. While testifying in her own defense, Sarah admitted using a bat while Jorge was inside the suitcase. She described Jorge getting his fingers out through an opening. She said she was terrified he was going to escape. She used the bat against his hand and around the suitcase in an effort to make him pull his hand back inside. Think about how much that changes the early version. Remember the first police interview. No physical altercation. Just a game. Just alcohol. Just forgetting. Now the jury was hearing that the situation had become so heated that Sarah was using a baseball bat to keep Jorge from getting out. Sarah's explanation was that she feared what he would do if he escaped. That is important. Because this is no longer really a debate over whether the game continued too long. By Sarah's own trial testimony, the playful phase had ended. She believed there was a threat. She wanted Jorge contained. She intentionally prevented him from coming out. And once you accept that, the central question changes again. Not, did Sarah accidentally forget a hide-and-seek game? But, what responsibility did Sarah have once she deliberately kept Jorge inside because she feared him? That is a far more serious question. The prosecution also had Jorge's injuries. Sarah's bat testimony provided one possible explanation for at least some bruising. The neighbor's report of a loud crashing sound remained another unresolved piece. Could the suitcase have gone down the stairs? Could Jorge have been injured in another way during the confrontation? The medical evidence could not reconstruct every second. And the state did not need to prove every bruise. The heart of the case was still the confinement. But now, when investigators' early suspicion was compared with Sarah's later testimony, something became clear. Her original story had left out an enormous part of the night. She did not simply zip Jorge inside and forget. By her own later account, she actively stopped him from getting out. And the jury had not even heard the strangest part of Sarah Boone's legal journey yet. Sarah Boone was arrested in February 2020. Her trial did not begin until October 2024. Some delay came from circumstances larger than Sarah. The COVID era disrupted courts across the country. Hearings moved. Schedules shifted. Cases backed up. But that does not explain everything. Sarah cycled through lawyer after lawyer. Court-appointed attorneys withdrew. Conflicts became severe. The phrase that repeatedly appeared in the legal record was essentially the same idea: the relationship between attorney and client had broken down beyond repair. Sarah challenged strategy. She complained about communication. She accused lawyers of failing her. She wrote long letters to the court. She demanded changes. Attorney after attorney left. By the time the case finally reached trial, James Owens was her 9th lawyer. Think about that number. 9. Not 9 lawyers working as one team. 9 different attorneys across the life of the case. The breakdown became so extreme that Judge Michael Kranick eventually ruled Sarah had forfeited her right to further court-appointed counsel through her conduct and would have to represent herself unless she obtained representation. That created another unusual moment. Sarah effectively advertised for a lawyer. Owens saw coverage of the situation and stepped in shortly before trial, representing her pro bono. And suddenly a case that had spent years stuck in legal limbo was moving. The defense strategy became clear. Battered spouse syndrome. Self-defense. Fear. The idea was not that Jorge never entered the suitcase. Sarah admitted that. The idea was not that the videos were fake. They were not. The defense had to explain what everyone could see and hear. So the argument shifted toward context. Why did Sarah leave him inside? Because she was afraid of what would happen if he got out. Why did she strike his hand with a bat? Because she believed he was trying to escape and would attack her. Why do the videos sound angry rather than playful? Because years of abuse had reached a breaking point. That was the defense. And shortly before trial, prosecutors gave Sarah another option. A plea offer. 15 years. Here is where some retellings of the case get the detail wrong. The offer was not 15 years for pleading guilty to second-degree murder. The proposed plea was to manslaughter, with a 15-year prison sentence. That was a massive decision. Accept it, and Sarah would know the sentence. Reject it, go before a jury on second-degree murder, and risk life in prison. Her lawyer advised her. Sarah rejected the deal. She maintained she did not intend to kill Jorge. She wanted the jury to hear her defense. If you knew only the phone videos, you might think refusing 15 years made no sense. But Sarah appeared to believe something very strongly. That if she could explain the relationship, explain the abuse, explain her fear, explain what was going through her mind, people would understand why the night unfolded the way it did. So she went to trial. And against the warnings that testifying can expose a defendant to devastating cross-examination, Sarah Boone took the witness stand. This was the moment Sarah had wanted for years. No police detective summarizing her. No prosecutor interpreting her words. No viral clip reducing the entire relationship to 2 minutes of video. Sarah could tell the jury herself. She described the day with Jorge. Cleaning the apartment. Drinking. Spending time together. Playing. The suitcase. She told jurors Jorge got inside himself. She said they thought it was funny. She demonstrated how she zipped it. She described moving the suitcase. And gradually, her testimony reached the point where the mood changed. According to Sarah, Jorge began trying to get out. His hand came through. She became afraid. She said she believed he might kill her if he escaped. So she used the baseball bat. Not to kill him, according to her. To keep him contained. She said she pushed at his hand in the suitcase until his hand went back inside. Her attorney asked the questions the defense needed answered. Did she believe Jorge could breathe? Sarah said yes. Did she believe he might die? She said no. Did she want him dead? No. Why not unzip the suitcase before going upstairs? Fear. She described herself as terrified. Now put that beside the videos. That is what the jury had to do. Sarah says she is afraid. The video captures her voice. Does she sound afraid? That is subjective. Different people can hear the same voice differently. Sarah says she believed Jorge could breathe. Jorge repeatedly says he cannot. Sarah says she feared he would get out. That part actually aligns with her admission that she used the bat to stop him. But if she was scared enough to prevent him from escaping, why did she not leave and call for help? That was the prosecution's problem for her. And the state had another uncomfortable point. If Sarah went upstairs because she was terrified Jorge would get out, that is hard to reconcile with the claim that she simply forgot he was in there. You can forget a joke. It is harder to forget the person you say you believed might kill you if he escaped. Cross-examination stripped away the softer language. Did Jorge tell you he could not breathe? Yes. Did you hear him? Yes. Did you let him out? No. Did you use the bat? Yes. Did you go upstairs? Yes. Did you check on him again during the night? No. Each answer narrowed the space between accident and responsibility. Sarah tried to explain the psychology behind those choices. She said outsiders did not understand the relationship. She said Jorge's behavior toward her had shaped the way she reacted. She said she did not believe he was going to die. And that last sentence is probably the most important argument in her defense. Because if she genuinely did not understand that death was a realistic possibility, the moral picture looks different from someone intentionally waiting for another person to die. But second-degree murder did not require the state to prove a detailed plan to kill. The jury had to decide whether Sarah's actions demonstrated a depraved disregard for Jorge's life. The state replayed the evidence. Not just the abstract idea of a suitcase. The voice. Jorge telling her he could not breathe. Sarah responding. The movement from inside. The anger in her words. The second recording. The injuries. The bat. The decision to go upstairs. The hours that followed. And the prosecutors made the timeline feel brutally simple. There were countless moments when the zipper could have been opened. One pull. That was all. Sarah's defense tried to place those seconds inside years of domestic violence. The prosecution tried to bring the jury back inside the living room. Whatever happened before, what threat did Jorge pose while trapped? Could Sarah leave? Could she call police? Could she get help? Did she need to keep him sealed inside? This is the part of the case where people often want a clean answer about the relationship. Who was the real abuser? Who started it? Who was worse? But the jury did not need to solve the entire relationship. They were deciding what Sarah did that night. And there was another piece of evidence the state used to challenge the idea that her anger suddenly appeared only because she was frightened in that moment. Messages from Sarah's phone showed hostility toward Jorge months earlier, including a text in which she wrote that she would get rid of him. That phrase by itself does not prove a murder plan. People say ugly things during toxic relationships. Context matters. But placed beside the video, it gave prosecutors another way to argue that resentment was not invented after the fact. By closing arguments, the two sides were essentially offering the jury two versions of the same physical facts. Version 1. Sarah Boone was a battered woman who believed the man in the suitcase remained dangerous. She kept him confined because she was afraid. She was intoxicated. She made catastrophic decisions. But she did not intend for Jorge to die. Version 2. Whatever Jorge had done in the past, Sarah had complete control of the danger that night. She knew he was trapped. She knew he was struggling. She heard him say he could not breathe. She intentionally prevented him from getting out. She mocked him. She walked away. And the prosecution did not need the jury to believe she planned it days in advance. They only needed the jury to believe that what she did showed a depraved disregard for whether Jorge lived or died. The case went to the jury on October 25, 2024. 4 years of motions. 9 lawyers. Hours of testimony. Domestic violence records. Experts. Body camera footage. Medical evidence. The suitcase itself sitting in court. And 2 short phone videos. The jury deliberated for about 90 minutes. That is not very long for a homicide trial. When they returned, Sarah Boone stood to hear the verdict. Guilty. Second-degree murder. She had rejected 15 years. Now the judge could sentence her to life. The verdict answered the legal question. It did not answer every human question. Did Sarah Boone begin that night intending to kill Jorge Torres? The jury was not required to find that. The prosecution did not prove some elaborate plan involving a suitcase prepared days earlier. The record supports something messy: alcohol, a volatile relationship, past violence, resentment, fear, control, a game that stopped being a game, a man trapped inside a confined space, a woman outside refusing to release him. Where exactly did foolishness become cruelty? Where did punishment become lethal disregard? We cannot draw a perfect line through Sarah's mind. That is probably why people are still fascinated by this case. If the video showed Sarah silently planning Jorge's death, the psychological question would be easier. Instead, we have something much stranger. Sarah talks to him. She argues with him. She references things he did to her. She seems focused on making him experience something. To understand something. To feel powerless. Maybe, in her mind, that was the point. But the suitcase did not care what the point was. Bodies still need oxygen. Position still matters. Time still passes. And Jorge remained inside. The sentencing hearing came on December 2, 2024. Jorge's family spoke. Their message was complicated in a way grief often is. Jorge was not presented as a flawless man. His life had problems. His relationship with Sarah had problems. There had been violence. But none of that changed how he died. His family had listened to recordings of him trapped inside a suitcase asking for help. They had watched the final minutes of his conscious struggle become courtroom evidence. Sarah also spoke. And this is one place where the version of the story sometimes repeated online is incomplete. It is not accurate to say she never expressed any apology. At sentencing, Sarah did ask for forgiveness, including from the Torres family. But her statement also remained heavily focused on the abuse she said she suffered from Jorge, her experience with the court system, and the way she believed the public misunderstood her. To people who wanted a simple expression of responsibility, it did not sound like enough. Judge Michael Kranick sentenced Sarah Boone to life in prison. And now go back to the first afternoon. Back before the trial. Back before 9 lawyers. Back before the battered spouse experts. Back before a jury heard anything about baseball bats, previous arrests, text messages, or the history of Sarah and Jorge's relationship. A deputy is standing outside an apartment. A man is dead. A woman says it was an accident. Hide and seek. Wine. A suitcase. She fell asleep. She forgot. And she voluntarily gives investigators her phone. That tiny decision is the hinge of the entire file. Without the recordings, police would still have problems. Jorge's injuries. The strange mechanics of the suitcase. The neighbors. Sarah's changing explanation. Maybe investigators still build a case. Maybe they do. But the phone removes the most important place for uncertainty to hide. Sarah could no longer say Jorge never told her he was in trouble. He did. She could no longer say she had no interaction with him after he was zipped inside. She did. She could no longer make the night sound like a harmless joke that quietly turned fatal while she was already asleep upstairs. Her own camera placed her beside the suitcase while the danger was happening. That is what makes this file so unsettling. Sarah Boone was not undone by evidence she failed to hide. She was undone by evidence she created herself. Evidence she carried in her own hand. Evidence she voluntarily gave to police. And maybe that is the most disturbing contradiction in the entire case. Sarah spent years arguing that people misunderstood what happened inside that apartment. But the strongest witness against her was never a neighbor, an ex-husband, a detective, or even a medical examiner. It was Sarah Boone. Her voice. Her phone. And 2 minutes in a living room where a man on the other side of a zipper kept telling her something she could never later say she did not hear. He could not breathe.